Chapter 10. Home. At first he was afraid to sleep, and so he paced the cabin. 3 steps forward, turn, 3 steps back. He stared at the wall. He stared at the ceiling. He pulled the window shade back and watched the city give way to long, rolling hills. Hills where the wind carved patterns in the swaying gray-black grass, and the aspen trees rattled fitfully their last withered white leaves. Vale to vale the train curved, till, coming to the base of the Silver Mountains, it began to climb, the engine roaring and lurching, dragging its steel tons up the steepening rail, higher and higher, through banks of low-lying cloud that swirled and incandesced, and out again into the open air. A dusting of snow had covered the high reaches, and it was partly this, as well as the altitude, that settled a remoteness within and without the cabin, a remoteness that made Mitsue feel as if he were venturing into an enormity meant only for giants. The train trundled over high lattice bridges and along winding mountain passes, through tunnels dark and deep and long, reemerging into the falling moonlight. Shapes beyond the window stretched, reduced from form to motion, to striations of light and dark slipping past the glass. Amid all that movement, Mitsue seemed to be the only thing holding still. And so, he paced. 3 steps forward, turn, 3 steps back. Restless miles he walked in segments the width of the cabin, in the aisle between the 4 bunk beds, 2 to each side, walking, yet getting nowhere, unable to elude his memories of the night's darkness, of the seething shapes, the open maws, the frantic hands, but mostly, memories of Ray. Every time he closed his eyes he saw her at the moment the fire took her, saw her convulsing against the stone floor, her eyes rolling back into her head, her arms flailing at her sides. It all moved slow, the memory viscous. Dark forms undulated along the floor and the walls and the ceiling. The candlelight sputtered, and there, in the memory, she turned to him, even as her consciousness dipped and went out. The light grew in her empty eyes, grew and grew till she was the light, till there was no distinguishing between the two, till she washed over him, erasing everything else. He wondered if she'd known what was happening in that fraction of a second as her life was snuffed out and the world collapsed around her. Had she known that she was dying, that this was her last breath, her last heartbeat? He imagined what it would be like to die. He closed his eyes, tried to visualize nothing, but then the train stuttered and he fell against the door. He wiped his tired eyes and resumed pacing. 3 steps forward, turn, 3 steps back. The fibers of memory clung together. Carefully he teased them apart. There must have been sound. A roar as the flames consumed them. Ray and Ernley and Krista. Screams as their skin melted and sloughed away, popping, sizzling, but in his head it was silent. There were no emotions either. No emotions cluttering up the memory. In his head it was like a map, a bare geography without slope or depth. He'd been afraid. He knew that. He must have been. Afraid to die. Afraid to watch Ray die. He must have been angry as well, angry that he couldn't save her, couldn't save any of them. Now in the train car he tried to reconstruct it, every hue of every thought that must have fired through his head as it unfolded. Yet even so, he couldn't remember it, as if he were watching it happen to someone else, living someone else's life. He examined the raw pink scar of the stigmata set into his left hand. How had he done it? That too escaped him. It was like asking how he moved his legs. He simply did. 3 steps forward, turn, 3 steps back. Long stretches of the train ride left no impression at all. He would stir from a waking reverie where the fire made a golden wreath in Ray's hair and wonder how much time had passed. Outside the world rolled over, the miles flitting past in the screech and thud of the wheels, and the black smoke drifting back from the engine, and the discordant cry of the train whistle. Everything had a surreal quality, as if the train were still and the world beyond were changing itself, molding itself, transforming itself into miles new and unspent. Passing through a small mountain town, shadows of people in the streets, clothing, hair, suits, ties, hats, dresses, the whistle screaming, directing the movements, the clatter of the wheels on the track, the whistle, the banging of the train cars, the whistle. The moon dipped down towards the horizon. At some point he sat down. He was so far beyond tired. He was watching it again. He was remembering her face, the dimple in her cheek, the freckles on her nose, the green fire in her eyes, when suddenly he felt vertigo, like it had flipped, and then he couldn't be sure whether he was remembering the black night in Leighton while riding the train, or remembering the train ride as he ran from the Noctura, as he climbed the narrow ladder to the attic in Abbess Carmine's office, as the fire spooled and raised eyes and wreathed her in a golden gown. Memory was living. He stared down into a mirrored pool like a sheet of silver. He caught his reflection staring up at him. He stepped out onto the water, and suddenly he stood beneath a night-black arch. A golden crack of light opened in the interstice, widening, scouring his eyes with its radiance. Thump, thump, thump. A great and terrible heartbeat. Blood pooled against his feet, rising up his ankles, his shins, his knees. The light shrieked and threaded the tiny hairs inside his ears. He couldn't bear it. He scrunched up his eyes. He tensed his body, feeling as if the light and the sound would shred him apart, to fragments, and fragments of fragments. But then it was as if he passed through the arch, and all sensation dissipated, faded out along his nerves. He stood beneath a tremendous light, unfathomable in its immensity, in its luminescence, like a tear in the sheath of the world through which primordial light poured. Spherical in shape, though not quite a sphere, its form in constant motion, trembling, convecting, whips of fire arcing out from its surface and diminishing back into the mass. He felt an upwelling of emotion, as if every cylinder of himself were crammed full, happiness and sadness and everything in between. But mostly, he felt an incredible terror. Thump, 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 the heartbeat told, and there was in that noise an unfamiliar malevolence, and he felt as if someone were watching him, weighing him. Someone, or something. Thump, thump, thump. He sat up in the dark. For a moment he couldn't remember where he was. His mind reeled. Then he heard the sound again, the thump. Knocking. Someone was knocking at the door. And then the train solidified around him once more, and he rose from the bunk, and he pulled the compartment door open. He had to shield his eyes from the hallway's light.